She came out of the Whiteout carrying 9 lives that were not her own, and the wind had already taken everything else. That was the first thing Calavas understood when she stepped through the tree line at the edge of the Ashveil border. Not that she had survived, not that her hands were numb to the wrist and her boots had soaked through 3 hours ago, but that the pups were still breathing, all 9 of them. She had counted them at every rest stop, pressing her palm to each small chest in the dark, feeling the flutter of heartbeat against her frozen fingers like a gift she did not deserve. 9. 9 still warm. 9 still here. That was the only number that mattered. Everything else, her rank, her name, her ruined life in the Greymoor Pack, had been swallowed by the storm long before she reached the ridgeline. The blizzard had come down without warning, the way northern storms always did in the Ashveil range, arriving not with gradual clouds but with a wall of white that dropped like a curtain being drawn across the sky. Calla had been moving the pups along the old trade trail between Greymore territory and the neutral foothills for 6 days by that point, traveling by night, resting in hollows, and beneath fallen timber by day, feeding them from the pack she carried on her back and from whatever she could forage at the edges of frozen creek beds. She had not been sleeping. She had not allowed herself to. Sleep was a thing for people whose charges were not in danger. And from the moment she had taken those 9 pups out of Greymore's eastern holding and walked into the tree line, every one of them had been in danger. But she had not been afraid. That surprised her still, even now, even as she stood at the border of a territory that belonged to a king who had every reason to turn her away. She had expected fear. She had expected the old familiar collapse of her own nerve, the thing that the Greymore wolves had always said was her greatest weakness, the thing her rank supposedly proved Omega, they called her, as if it were the name of a disease rather than a designation, as if it explained every failure they wanted to assign to her. But standing in that blizzard with 9 pups pressed against her body and the trail erased beneath 2 feet of fresh snow, she had not felt afraid. She had felt something closer to clarity. A narrow, cold, absolute certainty about what mattered and what did not. What mattered was 9 heartbeats. What did not matter was everything they had ever said about her. She had walked for 4 more hours after the storm hit at full force, navigating by the slope of the land beneath her feet, by the way the wind shifted when she passed below a ridgeline, by the faint chemical trace of pine resin she had learned in childhood to associate with the northeastern watershed. She had no compass. She had no map. She had the pups wrapped against her body in the layered wool and oilskin she had stripped from the holding's emergency stores before she left. And she had her own heat, which had been considerable at first and had dwindled steadily as the hours passed, until it was something small and banked and precious that she breathed on like an ember. The Ashveil border marker came out of the white like a dream, a carved granite post taller than her shoulder, marked with the sigil she had only ever seen on documents, and the occasional territorial map. 2 wolves rampant beneath a half-moon. The Ashveil crest. She stood in front of it for a long moment, with the pups nested in the sling against her chest, and the smaller 3 tucked inside her coat, their noses poking out just beneath her chin. The oldest of them, a dark-coated male she had taken to calling Soot, had his paw pressed against her throat as if he could feel her pulse and was taking comfort from it. She let herself believe that was true. She crossed the border post with her spine straight and her chin level. She did not know what would come next. She only knew that she had brought them this far. The rest, she would manage. She had not always been the kind of woman who walked into storms and kept moving. There had been a time, a long time, longer than it should have been, when Calavas had been the kind of woman who stayed exactly where she was told to stay, in exactly the place assigned to her, performing exactly the tasks that Omegas in the Greymoor Pack were expected to perform. She had convinced herself that this was enough, that smallness was a form of safety, that invisibility was something she had chosen rather than something that had been built around her, brick by brick, over the 15 years since she had come of age and been designated. The designation ceremony was something Calla had spent a long time trying not to think about. In the 3 years since it happened, she had kept it behind a door inside herself that she only opened on nights when the loneliness became too heavy to carry any other way. When she would press it out flat in her memory and examine it the way you might examine a scar, not for pleasure, but to remind yourself that you had survived it. She had been 23. It was a late designation by Greymore standards. Most wolves received theirs between 18 and 21, and there had already been whispers about her delay. Theories passed between the other unmated wolves in the communal halls in voices just loud enough for her to hear. Some said her wolf spirit was weak. Some said she had no true wolf at all, that she was a human who had been brought into the pack by mistake, a stray the alpha had taken pity on. The crueler ones said she was waiting because she was hoping foolishly, pathetically hoping for a mate bond with someone above her station. None of them had been wrong, exactly. She had been hoping, not for a specific person, not then, but for the possibility of something real. The designation ceremony was supposed to clarify that, to strip away ambiguity and reveal where each wolf stood in the pack's structure, where their instincts pulled, what they were made for. She had believed, with the specific and terrible earnestness of someone who had never been given a reason to stop believing, that hers would show something worth showing. She had walked into the ceremony circle on a clear October night with the moon at 3/4, which the pack seers said was a favorable phase for late designations. The alpha stood at the center Warwick Greymore, broad and silver-streaked even then, with the particular stillness of a man who has never needed to prove anything because everything has always been conceded to him. His mate stood at his left shoulder. His lieutenants flanked the circle. Every unmated adult in the pack stood at the perimeter because designation ceremonies were communal events meant to be witnessed. Calla had stood before him in the October cold and breathed the pine smoke and frost of the ceremony circle and told herself that whatever happened next, she would not flinch. The alpha had laid his hand on her shoulder. She had felt the pack magic move through her, warm, searching, definitive, and she had opened herself to it the way the old texts described, with what she'd thought was genuine submission, a true laying down of the self, and the magic had answered. She had felt it answer. Something in her chest had shifted and settled, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. And then Warwick Greymore had removed his hand, and he had looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was not unkind, but was not warm either, and he had said, clearly enough for every person in the circle to hear, Omega designation, support tier, communal service. She remembered the silence that followed, not the stunned silence of surprise, but the flatter, more resigned silence of people whose guesses had been confirmed. She remembered hearing from somewhere in the crowd a single exhaled breath that carried the particular shape of relief, as though her low designation had corrected an imbalance, had put something back in its proper place. She had not flinched. She had promised herself that, and she had kept it. She had walked out of the circle with her chin level and her hands still at her sides, and she had not cried until she was alone in the quarters she shared with 2 other low-designated wolves who had both been asleep and had not heard her. That was the night she had begun to build the door inside herself, the one she kept closed. The Greymoor Pack was not cruel in the way that fairy tales described cruelty. There were no beatings, no formal humiliations, no rituals of degradation for the low-ranked. It was subtler than that, and, in its subtlety, more total. Omegas in Greymore did the work that held the pack together at its most basic level. childcare, communal cooking, the tending of the sick and elderly, the maintenance of the smaller pack holdings on the outer ring of the territory. This work was necessary. Everyone said so. It was also invisible. Everyone behaved as though it weren't being done at all, as though food appeared, and the elderly were comforted, and the young were tended by some mechanism of the pack itself, requiring no particular effort or skill or sacrifice from any specific person. Calla had done this work for 3 years. She had done it with genuine care, because the pups and the elderly and the sick were real to her in a way that pack politics was not, and because she had always been. In the core of herself, that no designation ceremony could reach someone who did not know how to do things halfway. She had become, without quite intending to, the wolf that the pups ran to. Not because she was playful or funny, or because she told good stories, though she was, and she did. It was something else, something steadier than that. The young ones seemed to know, in the wordless way that very young things know things, that Calla Voss would not leave, that if the world went sideways, she would still be there. She had not known, when she began to build that reputation quietly and without ambition, that it would one day become the thing she needed most. It was the pups that told her something was wrong. 3 weeks before she left. Not in words, they were too young for most of them, ranging in age from 6 weeks to 4 months, but in the particular quality of their restlessness, the way they bunched together in the sleeping area of the holding, rather than spreading out as they usually did, the way they startled at sounds that shouldn't have frightened them. Pups were sensitive to pack atmosphere in a way that adults often were not. The protective instinct hadn't yet taught them to filter or dismiss what they sensed, and so they broadcast it plainly, in the language of small bodies and anxious eyes. Something was coming to Greymore. Calla had felt it too, in the undercurrent of the pack bond, a tightening, a gathering tension that she had at first attributed to the approaching winter and the anxieties that brought: food stores, territory patrols, the perennial argument about whether to reinforce the northern holding before the first freeze. But this was different. It had a directed quality, like pressure building behind a specific point in a wall. She had started listening more carefully. It was not easy for an Omega to get information in Greymore. She was not invited to the planning meetings. She was not briefed on territorial disputes or political negotiations. What she heard in fragments in the kitchen, in the corridors between the communal rooms, in the particular way that conversations stopped when she entered a space. She was good at fragments. She had spent 3 years learning to construct a picture from them. What she constructed, over the weeks of careful listening, made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up and stay up. Warwick Greymore had entered a treaty negotiation with the Veldrun Pack to the south, a territory-sharing agreement that would give Veldrun access to the Greymore Northern Highlands in exchange for military support in a border. Dispute to the east. This was not, in itself, unusual. Packs negotiated. Territories shifted. What was unusual was the addendum that she pieced together from 3 separate overheard conversations. One accounting document she saw left open on the communal hall table, and a single sentence dropped by one of the Alpha's lieutenants in a corridor that he thought was empty. The addendum involved children. Specifically, it involved 9 pups in the Eastern Holding Pups, whose bloodlines traced back to the old Ashvale lineages before the territory split. Pups who carried in their designation potential the echo of a magic that the Veldrun Pack's new Alpha was known to covet. The word she kept hearing, in fragments and half-sentences, was leverage. The word she heard once from the lieutenant in the corridor was hostage. She had gone back to the Eastern Holding that evening and stood in the doorway watching the 9 pups sleep in their bundle in the corner, Soot's dark head tucked under the chin of the smallest one. a pale female the other caretakers called Ghost. She had stood there for a long time. She had gone back to her quarters and sat on the edge of her cot and thought very carefully about what she was and what she was not. She was an Omega. She was a communal tier wolf with no political standing, no fighting designation, no connections outside of Greymore. She had no resources beyond what she could carry. She had no authority to remove those pups from pack custody. She had no plan. She had nowhere to go. She thought about all of this for approximately 4 hours. Then she got up and began to pack. She had chosen Ashveil because it was the direction she knew best, and because the pups' bloodlines ran there, which meant, in the logic of pack magic, that the territory would respond to them, that the land itself would be less hostile to their presence. She had no contact in Ashvale. She had no way of knowing how their king would receive her. What she knew of Dorian Ashvale was what most wolves in the northern ranges knew, that he had taken the Ashvale throne at 28 after his father's death, that he had rebuilt the pack's military and economic structure in under a decade, that he was considered by every neighboring pack to be either a genius or a problem, depending on which side of a negotiating table you were on. He was 33 now, unmated. His designation, unlike most alphas, had not been a public ceremony. There were rumors about what that meant, theories that circulated through the northern packs, the way rumors about powerful people always did, accumulating detail that may or may not have had any relationship to truth. She had not chosen Ashvale because she trusted him. She had chosen Ashvale because the pups' bloodlines pulled that direction, and because the Ashvale pack had, as far as she could determine, never been complicit in child hostage arrangements. That was enough. It had to be. She had left Greymore on a Tuesday night, 3 hours before moonrise, with the 9 pups distributed between the sling at her front, the modified pack frame on her back, and the inside of her coat. Soot had settled immediately against her chest, as though this were perfectly normal. The others had taken varying amounts of time to quiet, and the youngest Ghost, pale as her name, had whimpered for nearly an hour before exhausting herself into sleep. Calla had not looked back. She had told herself, standing at the boundary marker, with the pups' combined warmth against her body and the dark of the tree line ahead, that she was not running away. She was walking towards something. She was doing what she was built for, in the deepest part of herself that had never matched her designation. She was protecting what mattered. The 6 days of travel had been the hardest thing she had ever done, and she had done it without collapsing, without turning back, and without losing any of the 9 lives in her care. The blizzard had taken the last of her reserves, physical, thermal, the small psychological store she had been drawing on since she left, and when she crossed the Ashvale border marker and walked another 300 yards into the territory and finally stopped because her legs had reached some fundamental limit, she was so cold that she had stopped shivering, which she understood, distantly and without particular alarm, was not a good sign. She sat down against the lee side of a large spruce. She arranged the pups. She made sure every one of them was warm, pulling the extra oilskin over the outer ones, tucking Ghost more firmly against her sternum. She counted them again. 9. 9 warm. 9 breathing. She leaned her head back against the bark and closed her eyes. Just for a moment. Just to rest them. She did not intend to fall asleep. The Ashvale Border Patrol moved at intervals that Dorian's security chief had revised 3 months ago in response to increased activity in the neutral foothills, shorter gaps, overlapping routes, paired patrols rather than singles. It was Wren, one of the younger patrol wolves, who first caught the scent at the spruce grove, something that did not belong, layered and complex. the particular olfactory signature of multiple very young wolves and one adult who was burning too cold. Wren sent the alert through the bond channel and held position, approaching slowly, reading the scene before moving in. What he found was a woman sitting against the base of the spruce in the posture of someone who had sat down just to rest and had not come back from it. Her coat was open. She had opened it. He understood when he saw the arrangement. Deliberately opened it to give the pups inside her clothing more contact with her body heat, sacrificing her own insulation for theirs. There were others in a sling at her chest, more wrapped in oilskin arranged around her sides. He counted, carefully, and arrived at 9. He counted the adult, too. 1, barely. Her lips had gone the pale bluish color that he had been trained to recognize. He was already unbuttoning his outer layer when the bond channel shifted with a different frequency. Not the patrol net, but the direct channel that moved only between the king and his immediate circle. He had contacted the patrol lead without thinking about it, and the patrol lead had done something that Wren hadn't expected. Instead of dispatching a recovery team, she had sent directly to the Alpha. Dorian Ashveil arrived in 14 minutes, which was faster than the distance should have allowed. He came through the trees without sound, the kind of silence that came not from stealth, but from intention, from a body that moved in its environment with complete familiarity. He was in his patrol gear, which meant he had been at the security outpost when the alert came through, and he had come himself instead of sending runners. Wren noticed this and filed it away in the part of his mind that kept track of the things his Alpha did that did not match the political portrait the other packs maintained. Dorian crouched at the woman's side. He did not touch her immediately. He looked at her first at the pups arranged against and around her body, at the oilskin, at the sling's construction, at her hands, which were the color of old wax and curled against the pups' backs as though still trying to warm them. He looked at her face. He was quiet for a long moment. "She's alive," Wren said, unnecessarily. "Yes." His voice was level, not flat. There was something in it that Wren could not name, a frequency beneath the word that his instincts registered without his mind quite catching it. "Get the emergency thermal kit from the patrol cache, both of them." Wren went. He moved fast. Dorian sat in the snow beside the woman and put his bare hand against the side of her throat, feeling for the pulse. It was there, slower than it should have been, and too quiet, but there. He kept his hand where it was, because his temperature ran higher than average, a physiological characteristic of his designation that he had spent a great deal of his life learning to be careful with. Learning to modulate. Learning not to let it mean anything beyond what it was, which was a biological fact. He was not careful now. He let the heat move from his hand into her skin and stayed still and watched the slow rise of her chest. The pups were awake. The dark-coated one had his eyes fixed on Dorian with an expression of preternatural alertness that was unusual in an animal that young. Dorian met the pup's gaze and held it. And the pup, after a long moment, made a small sound and pushed his nose against the woman's chin. She stirred. Her eyes opened, and Dorian watched the return to consciousness happen in stages. The unfocused initial awareness, the sharpening, and then the very specific and striking thing that happened when she looked at him and understood where she was. There was no panic, no flinch. She looked at him with gray eyes that were still cold-dulled but were already sharpening with intelligence. And the first thing she did, before she tried to speak, before she assessed him, before she did anything else, was move her hands to the pups, checking them. One by one, her fingers found the nearest small bodies, and she counted. and he watched her count and watched something in her face settle when she arrived at 9. Then she looked at him again. "The pups," she said, and her voice was rough and distant with cold. "They need warmth first." "They'll have it," he said. "So will you." "Me second." Her gaze was entirely steady. "Them first." He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "All right," he said. "Them first." She held his gaze for another beat, and something passed across her face that was not gratitude exactly, and was not calculation exactly. It was something older and more careful than either of those things. Then she let her eyes fall closed again, not in unconsciousness, but in the particular, deliberate way of someone who has decided, for the moment, to trust. Ren came back with the thermal kits, and they set to work. The next several hours were managed rather than experienced. At least from Call's perspective, she surfaced and submerged in the warmth of whatever outpost or structure they had brought her to, registering details in fragments: stone walls, fire, the smell of pine resin, and something warmer beneath it, something she did not have a name for yet. The pup sounds, close and alive, and increasingly indignant in the specific way of young animals who have been cold too long and are now warm enough to complain about it. Hands that were competent and efficient and did not linger. Voices that kept their distance unless they were speaking to her directly. The dark-coated pup was beside her face every time she surfaced, and she understood from the particular weight of him that someone had placed him there, deliberately. She came back fully on the second day, which she did not immediately know was the second day, to find herself in a room with stone walls and a window through which she could see that the blizzard had passed, and the sky above the Ashvale territory was the specific pale blue of a winter morning that has decided to be beautiful about it. She was warm in a way that felt earned rather than given, the kind of warmth that starts at the core and works outward. Her hands were bandaged. The bandages were not constricting. They were loose, functional, the work of someone who knew the difference between treating frostbite and making the patient feel managed. The pups were in a large padded crate near the fire, all 9 of them in a heap, rising and falling, with the collective breath of things that have decided, together, to be all right. She counted them from the bed without moving, tracking dark heads and pale ones, the particular fold of Soot's ear, the tuck of Ghost's chin beneath Soot's foreleg. 9. She sat up carefully and found that her body was sore in a distributed, fundamental way that confirmed everything she remembered about the past week. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed for a moment and collected herself. Then she stood. She was halfway across the room to the pup crate when the door opened. He was not what she had prepared for, which unsettled her in a way that she recognized as important information. She had prepared for an alpha. She knew what alphas looked like in her experience, Warwick Greymore's particular brand of contained authority, the way he occupied a room by never quite acknowledging it. She had expected something like that. What she got was a man who stood in the doorway of her room in plain woolen boots and looked at her with dark eyes that were doing something complicated and careful, and who said, when he saw her standing, "You shouldn't be up yet," in a tone that was not in order. "I wanted to see the pups," she said. He moved out of the doorway to let her past, not dramatically, not with the deliberate courtesy that signals performance, but simply stepped aside, the way a person does when they have genuinely considered your trajectory. She went to the crate and crouched, and pressed her palm to the nearest warm back, and she stayed that way for a moment, while 9 small hearts beat under her hands. He had come to stand a few feet behind her. She could feel the warmth of him, not metaphorically, Not as impression, but physically, a several degrees difference in the air between her back and the rest of the room. 9 pups, he said, from the Greymoor Eastern Holding. Yes, you carried them from Greymore, through the blizzard. I walked, she said. They couldn't walk. The silence had a quality to it that she did not know how to interpret, yet not disapproval, not assessment exactly, something more like consideration. You're Calavas, he said. She turned her head to look at him over her shoulder. He was watching her with an expression that had been taken down to something spare and factual, and beneath that spareness, she could see something working. How do you know my name? Because I've been looking for you, he said. For several months, not you specifically. I didn't have a name. I had a description. An Omega in the Greymore communal tier who had been asking questions she shouldn't have been asking, accessing records she had no formal reason to access, and spending an unusual amount of time with the pups in the Eastern Holding. He paused. My intelligence net reported the pattern. I was trying to understand what it meant. She turned fully to face him then, still crouched, which put her below his eyeline. She did not stand immediately. She looked at him from where she was and thought about the 3 months she had spent listening in corridors and reading documents left on tables, and about the way she had told herself she was invisible, because Omegas were always invisible. I wasn't invisible, she said. No, he said. You were not. She stood. She was not short, but he was taller than that, and she looked up at him with the careful eyes of a woman who has learned to read faces, because faces were the documents she had access to. What she read in his was not what she expected to read. Why were you looking? Because I knew about the addendum, he said. The treaty addendum. The pups. His jaw moved briefly. The Veldran Pack's new alpha has been circling the northern ranges for 2 years, building leverage through asset acquisition. I had been working through diplomatic channels to flag the addendum as a violation of the cross-pack protection protocols for minor wolves. I had not moved fast enough. She looked at him. You moved faster, he said. The words were simple and entirely without condescension, and they landed differently because of that. Not as compliment, not as amazement, but as plain acknowledgement. The way you might acknowledge a fact about weather or distance. She felt something in her chest do something she had not felt it do in a long time. Something that was not the collapsing feeling of being seen for damage, but the rarer and stranger feeling of being seen accurately. I didn't have diplomatic channels, she said. I only had feet. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was something more precise than a smile. That appears to have been sufficient. She looked at him for another moment and then looked back at the pups, because the pups were something she knew how to manage, and what was happening in this room was something she was still learning the shape of. What happens to them now? She asked. The pups. That depends partly on what you want, he said. She turned back. I'm an Omega from a foreign pack, with no political standing, no resources, and no authority over these pups beyond the fact that I brought them here. You're aware that I have no formal claim. Yes. He was watching her face with the same careful attention he had given her in the snow at the spruce tree, the same quality of looking like someone reading a document that matters. I'm also aware that they appear to believe otherwise. He gestured slightly toward the pup crate, where Soot had gotten his front paws up on the edge and was tracking the conversation with an expression of intense involvement. Calla looked at the pup. The pup looked at her. It was, she thought, not an argument she could win. Their bloodlines are Ashveil, she said. Yes. Something shifted in his voice. As is their designation potential. The pack magic in this territory will support them in ways that Greymoors could not. They belong here, in that sense. He paused. As do you. She was quiet. The fire moved behind her, and the warmth of the room pressed against her bandaged hands, and she stood in the space between what he had just said and what she knew how to do with it. I don't have Ashveil bloodlines, she said. No, he agreed. You have something else. He moved, then not toward her, but to the window, where the winter morning light came through at an angle that caught the silver and dark of him, and made something in the room feel very still. He stood with his back partially turned, which she understood, after a moment, was deliberate. He was giving her the window, giving her the view of the territory, giving her something to look at that was not him, because he had understood, in some way she had not yet traced, that she needed room. The pack magic responded to you, he said. When you crossed the border. My border sentinel. It's not a person, it's a mechanism, a reading that the territory's wolf spirit keeps for me. It flagged your crossing differently than it flags most crossings. I was at the outpost when the patrol alert came, but I had already been alerted by something older. He paused. I don't know what to make of that yet. I'm telling you, because you should know. She looked at his profile against the winter light and thought about the designation ceremony in the October Circle, about the pack magic moving through her and settling, and about what Warwick Greymore had said, and what she had felt the key turning in a lock, and whether those two things had ever, in 3 years, added up to each other. My designation, she said. Yes. Omega. Support tier. Communal service. That is what Greymore read. That is what the ceremony produced. Yes. He turned to look at her then. Calla. In Greymore's magical framework, the designation ceremony reads what the pack magic of that territory can recognize, what it can categorize. Greymore's wolf spirit is old, and it is narrow. It has a fixed set of channels, a fixed vocabulary for what a wolf can be. He let that sit for a moment. There are things it cannot name. She held very still. The pack bond in this territory is different, he said. It has a broader vocabulary. It has categories that the old Greymore framework does not include because they fell out of practice 2 centuries ago when the territory split. He looked at her with those dark eyes that were doing the complicated, careful thing. Again, specifically, it includes the category of anchor. The word moved through the room like a stone dropped into water. An anchor, she said. It was not a question. A wolf whose designation function is not support of the communal tier, but stabilization of the pack itself, the deepest structural layer, the thing that holds the bond network together when it comes under pressure. What Greymore called Omega, and used as a servant designation, is in the older system a term for the structural core. Not the lowest rank. The root. She thought about 9 pups pressed against her in a blizzard. She thought about 6 days and the way she had not felt afraid, only clear. She thought about the pack magic turning in her chest like a key on the night of the designation ceremony, and how she had opened herself to it, and it had answered, and what it might have been answering if not the word that Warwick Greymore had put on it. She thought about the door she had built inside herself, and the fact that she had never stopped believing behind it that there was something on the other side. You can't know that from a border reading, she said. No, he agreed. I can know it from the fact that 9 pups in a blizzard followed your instinct to stay alive, rather than their own instinct to freeze in place. Pack animals, very young ones, in extreme cold, will instinctively denning. They'll stop moving and cluster and wait. Yours did not. They stayed with you. They moved with you. They moved because you were moving, because they read you as their structural reference. He paused. That is not what happens with a support tier caretaker. That is what happens when the pack bond recognizes an anchor. The morning light shifted. The fire behind her breathed. She thought about Soot's paw pressed against her throat in the blizzard, counting her pulse. She thought about Ghost, tucking herself against Kalla's sternum as though she were the center of something. They knew, she said softly. Not to him, to herself. They always knew, he said. Young wolves have not yet learned to read designations through political frameworks. They read the bond directly. She looked at the pup crate, where Soot had given up on the edge and settled back against the others, but whose eyes were still fixed on her with the expression of patient certainty she had come to know well. She looked at him for a long time. Then she turned back to the man in the winter light. "What are you offering?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who is choosing words with genuine care. Asylum for the pups, first. That is already done. It was done the moment Wren sent the alert. The cross-pack protection protocols cover them the moment they enter this territory, and I will not be sending them back. He met her gaze. For you, I can offer the same asylum, on whatever terms you choose. You can stay as a guest. You can be formally received into the pack on whatever tier you prefer, including none. There are wolves in this territory who operate outside the designation structure entirely, by choice. You can leave, if you want to leave, with an escort to wherever you want to go. Another pause. Or you can allow the territory's pack magic to complete the reading it began when you cross the border, and we can know for certain what it finds. He said the last option in the same even tone as the others. He did not lean on it. He did not perform the absence of leaning on it. He simply said it, and then waited. What would that ceremony involve? She asked. The same thing any designation review involves in Ashveil territory, he said. You stand in the bond circle. The wolf spirit reads you. I tell you what it finds. He paused. Nothing is binding. Nothing changes based on the result, unless you choose to let it. She looked at him. Why does it matter to you? The question was direct, and she meant it to be. She had spent 3 years in a place where she learned to read faces, and his face was doing something that she did not think he was aware of, or if he was aware of it, he had decided to let her see it anyway. It was something older than politics and quieter than attraction, and it was the same thing she had read in him at the spruce tree in the snow, when he had sat beside her in the cold and kept his hand against her throat and had not moved. He held her gaze for a long moment. Because I have been alpha of this territory for 5 years, he said, and something has been missing from the pack bond that I could not name. And when you cross the border, that thing fell into place, and I do not think that is nothing. The room was very quiet. She did not say anything immediately. She sat with the weight of what he had said and turned it in her hands, the way she would turn any piece of information she had gathered from fragmented sources slowly, examining the way it was put together, checking its seams. She thought about what it would mean to trust that. She thought about what it had cost her, the 3 years of not trusting it, of making herself small, of building the door, of deciding that the turning of the key in her chest on the night of the designation ceremony was not information, but delusion. She thought about 9 pups and 6 days, and a blizzard, and the particular quality of clarity she had felt when the storm hit and she had not been afraid. She thought about the word anchor and how it did not feel like something being given to her but something being returned. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "The bond circle," she said. "Let the territory read." The ceremony was nothing like the one in the October Circle in Greymore. There was no crowd, no formal arrangement, no performance of witness judgment. It was Calla and the Alpha, and the frozen winter ground of an Ashveil inner courtyard, cleared of snow but cold-packed and still, with the half-moon of the Ashvale crest carved into the stone of the courtyard's central marker, and the territory's wolf spirit present in the way that very old pack magic was present, not visible, not dramatic, but suffusing the air like the particular quality of light that comes before weather. Calla stood at the center with her bandaged hands at her sides and her feet planted and her chin level. Dorian stood at the circle's edge. He would not place his hand on her shoulder the way Warwick had. That was not how Ashvale's pack magic worked. Here, the territory read the wolf directly, without an intermediary's translation. Here, the bond spoke in its own language. Calla breathed. She opened herself to it the way she had in October 3 years ago, with the same deliberate laying down of the self. But this time, she did not brace for the result. This time, she had already been through the storm, and she had a different relationship to what she was. The pack magic moved through her like the warmth at the core of something that has been waiting, and it did not search the way Greymore's had searched, testing and categorizing. It recognized. She felt it recognize her, and she felt what it found, and what it found was not small, and it was not supplementary, and it was not the lowest note in a scale. It was the note the scale was built on. She felt the wolf spirit settle into her like a key into a lock she had always known was there. And she heard Dorian's voice from the edge of the circle say quietly, "Anchor, primary resonance, first designation." A pause, as I said. She opened her eyes. He was watching her from the circle's edge with an expression that had been stripped down to something she had not seen on his face yet. Not the careful calculation, not the political distance. Something underneath all of it, plain and unmistakable and not at all what she had known how to ask for. "As you said," she agreed. He walked to the center of the circle. He stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth of him directly, that differential of temperature that was not metaphor but physics. And he was looking at her with the dark eyes that had been doing the complicated, careful thing since the first time she had opened her eyes and seen him in the snow. Except that now, the complicated thing had resolved into something simple. The way complicated things do when they have finally found their answer. "The pack bond has a mate function," he said. His voice was very even. "It presents in anchor designations. It binds the anchor to the alpha of the territory at the structural level, the same level at which the anchor holds the pack. It does not require consent, but it does not activate without it. It is waiting." He looked at her. "It has been waiting since you crossed the border." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it meant to be made into a thing that serves and told it was your nature. She thought about what it meant to be given a different name for the same thing you had always been and told it was an honor. She was careful with that, and he must have seen her being careful because he said nothing else. He waited. He was, she had already learned, good at waiting. "If I say yes," she said, "what does that look like? Practically." "You would be paired to this territory's bond structure at its root," he said. "The pack would know it. The pack bond would know it. The mate bond is..." He paused. "It is not a transaction. I want to be clear about that." I am not offering you the mate bond as payment for the pups, or as compensation for what Greymore did to you. I am offering you the choice because you have one, and because the magic is there, and because I am not going to stand in a winter courtyard in front of a woman who walked 9 pups through a blizzard and pretend that I do not know exactly what I am looking at. Calla was quiet. She looked at him, and she looked at the courtyard, and she looked at the Ashveil crest cut into the stone, 2 wolves rampant beneath a half-moon, and she thought about what it meant to walk towards something rather than away from it. You said the magic in Greymore couldn't name me, she said. Yes, but you could, even before the ceremony. He held her gaze. Yes. She breathed out slowly. The cold caught her breath and carried it away toward the pale blue sky, and for a moment, she watched it go, that small, visible evidence of warmth, and she thought about the ember she had breathed on in the blizzard to keep alive. She had kept it. It was still going. Yes, she said. I consent. The mate bond moved between them like the warmth she had been reaching toward for 6 days and 3 years, and whatever came before, not crashing, not overwhelming, but settling, fitting. The particular completeness of a thing that has found where it belongs. He raised his hand and touched her face, his palm against her cheek, and the warmth was what she had already known it would be real, and not small, and entirely unperformed. Calla, he said. I know, she said. Inside the outpost building, the pups were awake and making their morning sounds, Suit's decisive small bark, Ghost's ascending whimper that always meant she was hungry and was building toward announcing it formally, the various middle register protests of 7 others who had opinions about breakfast. The sounds came through the stone wall with perfect clarity, carrying into the courtyard the ordinary, irreplaceable noise of 9 small lives that were warm and fed, and here and arguing about it, and Calla listened to them, and felt the mate bond warm against her chest, and the pack magic root itself in her, like something that had been waiting in the soil all winter, and she thought that this was what it felt like to stop being small, not to become large, not to become powerful in the way power was usually meant, but to become exactly the size of what you actually were, which was something that the door she had built could not contain, and that no word a frightened man put on her in an October circle had ever managed to diminish, because the thing itself was older than his word for it, and it had simply waited, in the cold and the dark and the long ordinary years of her service, for the night she would pick up 9 lives and walk into a storm and refuse to put them down. And she had been exactly that thing all along, through every small humiliation and every silent corridor and every night she had pressed her palm to a pup's chest to feel the flutter of its heart, and given that flutter the whole of her attention. She had been the root, and the root had held, and now the territory knew it, and the man beside her knew it, and the 9 voices inside the wall knew it in their bones, without having needed anyone to tell them at all.